So my friend Curran Keller is back in town. He and I have been collaborating on a couple of projects since he departed the Bay Area last year. So I like to say that I like to outsource to India for my projects, which is cool. Well, it's kind of weird because I'm an Indian in America, outsourcing to an American in India. This is globalization, I guess, for you in action. So we're going to talk a little bit. Well, Curran's going to do most of the talking because you guys know I don't like to talk. So Curran's going to do a lot of the talking, and I'll just kind of help fill in some blanks here and there. But without further ado, I'd like you to please give a very warm Bay Area welcome back to Curran Keller.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Curran, and I'm going to talk about visualizing campaign finances in the U.S. So about a year ago, I started this company, DataViz Tech. We do data visualization consulting services since January 2016. And this is pretty much Seemant and I doing these consulting projects remotely for mainly clients in the U.S. And on our homepage, dataviz.tech, there are these highlighted projects. I'm going to talk about this one, the Campaign Finance Institute project. The Campaign Finance Institute is an organization that it's like a nonprofit that does research about campaign finance law. And they've been collecting this big database of campaign finance laws for a couple of years now, for a good number of years. And so this project is about presenting that database to the public. And so when we started this project, this is what we got. A Microsoft Access database file, .mdb, right? And so we're like, what do we do with this? Okay, so we actually, this was Seemant's doing. He found some nice open source tools that we could use to extract this Microsoft Access database into a bunch of CSV files. So that was a step up for us. We were like, oh great, we can load this with D3. We can read this.
Step one.
Step one.
Pay attention. To visualize, you must read it.
Yes. So this is what we got. These are the tables of their database. And the first thing that we were going to do was generate a proof of concept for them and play around with some ways of visualizing the data. So we opened up one of these files. This is what we see. It's at first I really couldn't make heads or tails of it. I had no idea what the columns meant. And but one thing sort of stood out, that in all these files there's a state column, which is the abbreviation for the U.S. state, and then there's a year column. And this is sort of the backbone of all the data here. They have data about combinations of state and year. And so one of the first things we tried, actually Seemant tried, was this choropleth map. Would you want to discuss the process here? No? Okay. So this is sort of a very first pass at visualizing this, because it has U.S. states. Why not use a map of the U.S.? And then...
is this how we sold them the work?
Yeah. Yeah, this got us the project. This is before they paid us anything, or even agreed to pay us anything. We did this. So the states are spread out over the map. There are drop-down menus. One is for year, so you can switch the year, and it switches the data that's shown. First interaction. And then corp to canned is the field name. So that's the column in the CSV. So actually well, that'll come later. We joined all the CSVs together based on the year and the state. So this was a first prototype, the map, which is one of the components of the project. And then the other component, it ended up being a component. Initially, it was a proof of concept. I thought to myself,
this is what sold them on it.
Yeah, this is what sold them on it. I don't know. Taken together, we visualized the data. So this is a grid layout of sort of the backbone of their data set. There are years going from top to bottom, and then the states are going from left to right. I think in no particular order. But this is one of those things that, wait for that train to pass.
Just like in India.
Right, it's just like in India. So the thing about this one is that it allowed us to show the entire data set. It allowed us to explore the entire data set because I had one drop-down menu here that let us switch between the fields of the CSV files. And then that common backbone to all the data was shown with X and Y, which are the most powerful visual channels. When you visualize data, X and Y are the most powerful visual channels. And then we're using color here to encode the values of each cell for that field. And one of the fields, for example, this one is text. The values are text. And then other fields have also text, but fewer unique values, like yes, no. And so this is visualizing yes and no for each combination of year and state. And at this point, we still have no idea what the columns mean.
Like cola. Actually, we had no idea what cola is.
Cola.
In fact, we still don't know what cola is.
We still don't.
I think it went away. We don't actually know what cola is.
That's cost of living allowance.
Is that what it is? Thanks. Now we know what cola is.
Cost of
You should have joined our project.
But it's a binary value. So.
It's Coke versus Pepsi. That's it.
Right, cola. I'm like, oh yeah, I like drinking that sometimes. Might make me sick, but you know.
It's a way of kind of determining.
So this was our first pass at visualizing the data. This is still before we got the project. And then from here we iterated. This is something that Simon tried, which is the combinations of year and state going along the x-axis and all the various values for the fields going across the y-axis. Or no, flipped.
I think we did this to figure out. So I did this to figure out. All right. So
Can I
Yeah.
record your voice here?
Thank you. So we did this because one of the things that was a characteristic of this project
I think it should be, sorry,
Here.
a little farther. Yeah,
Here.
there you go.
How's this?
Right.
Can you hear me now? Can you guys hear me? I don't think this makes a difference, but can you hear me? Okay, good. So one of the things that was characteristic about this particular assignment or this project was that the data set was evolving, and in fact continues to do so to this very minute. It's still evolving. You can go to the data set now and you'll see it breathing. And what was going on at the time was they were so early in transferring this data set from sort of being transcribed into being digitized that not all the fields were populated. And so I made this map just to kind of see how empty or full the database actually was. So where we saw green, or where we saw sort of these lack of, can you see where I'm pointing? Obviously not. Wherever you see sort of the areas of white, especially sort of, you can see up in that mini map, right? Like there's that whole series of information that's just missing. And so these were the kinds of things that we were drawing their attention to. Sorry, Carl, thank you.
Indeed, the data set is sparse, and there are a couple fields that just have a lot of empty space. So that's interesting. We called this, at some point we called it the data inventory grid, which is a cool name. It's the inventory of which cells are filled in. Some of the fields are numbers, and some of the fields are not numbers. And so one of the challenges was to figure out, okay, we have this grid, and we kind of like this, and they liked it as the backbone, the sort of backbone for the visual representation. One of the challenges was, how can we use this grid structure to encode both numbers and not numbers, strings, categories? And so what we did is we used a threshold scale, D3 threshold scale, to bin the numbers into these different gradations of color. So color is one of these amazing channels where you can actually encode numbers and categories. So for numbers, gradations are nice because gradations from light to dark, it has like a continuity, You can say this is darker than that or this is lighter than that. That's good for numbers and bins of numbers. And different colors, totally different colors, are great for representing different categories, totally different categories. So this is sort of the approach that we settled on. We're going to have a grid, and we're going to have colors. And also the map. The map comes in too, and the colors are going to match between the grid and the map. So this is the basic approach that we used to get the project started. And then one of the first interactions we added was Tooltips. And you can add this to basically any visualization, and it's pretty easy to do. We're using a library called D3Tip, which is pretty nice. I mean, it has its limitations, but it's pretty nice. And so this gives you the interaction of when you hover over one of these circles, you get this information about what that means. This is great because the color just tells you which bin it's in. It doesn't tell you the value. You can't read the value out of the color. But if you hover over it, you can see that, okay, in Washington, in 2008, the value for this field is $1,000. So that was a big step up. Now we have an interactive data visualization. And we also experimented with size to encode the numbers. My thinking with this was, I don't really like the binning aspect of the colors. When you use color to encode numbers, often you use a threshold scale which categorizes the numbers into these bins, and each bin has a color. So if you look at the color, you don't know, is it at the top of the bin, the bottom of the bin? No idea. But if you use area of a circle to encode the number, you can visually tell more precisely the differences between the values. So I thought it looked cool. I got a thrill when it worked. But the client didn't like this at all, so we didn't go with it. And then one recurring theme with this project is that we use threshold scales for color, but then there's sort of special things at the ends. It's not just thresholds. It's like at the end of it, it's like no limit. In this case, it's no limit. These are maximum contribution limits. And this is the first topic of the data set that we started to sort of understand and dig deeper into. For each state and year, this table shows the maximum contribution limits of an individual person to a candidate for the House. That's what H is. There are these three drop-down menus at the top, and this is one configuration. And this is actually how the fields break down. Initially, I was like, I couldn't make heads or tails of the fields. But I think Simon is the one who came up with this scheme for these drop-down menus. It's a combinatorial thing. There's options for the donor, which is the first of these menus. There's options for the recipient, which is the second of these menus. And then, depending on that combination, there may or may not be options for the third drop-down, which is which branch of government, the House, the Senate, or governor. And so that's the coverage of this database, really. And then we begin to understand, wow, they spent a lot of effort collecting this data over the years with surveys.
Yeah, two questions. One, did you have to address colorblindness for this?
Oh, great question. Did we have to address colorblindness? Well,
Awesome question.
That's a great question. Actually, the main guy in charge at the Campaign Finance Institute has colorblindness. Is that right?
Yeah, he's
Simon?
partially blind. He's partially.
So Ken, as far as colorblindness, yes, he does have a little bit of visual impairment for color. The impairment that actually has been front and center for this visualization has been in terms of size. So for him, legibility of the fonts and the drop downs and reading the thing actually became his bigger challenge. And as Curran actually progresses through this, you're just seeing the very beginnings of it. As we go through it, you'll get a better idea of the kind of color challenge we're facing. And I would love to take this into a fully accessible kind of colorblind version, and I would love any input you have on that, but wait until we get through some of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have another question. In terms of the data architecture here, did you split up this data for each visualization, or are you doing, when you change the selects there, are you doing a database, Ajax thing to get fresh data, or how do you?
Oh, right.
Right, that's a great question. So in terms of the data architecture, are we fetching from a database? And what's going on? Well, the whole data set is like 7 megabytes. So we're just front loading all of it and then holding it in memory. Yeah, and then we're just accessing, in memory with D3, we're doing a join on all the tables. And so we have a row object for each year state combination. And then we just read different fields out of memory when we change these drop downs. So the interaction's instantaneous, but it takes a couple seconds to load. Yeah, that's what's going on there. No database at all. Yeah, our sort of philosophy is like, if we don't have to have a piece of infrastructure that we're in charge of, like, we'd rather not. So that's what we're doing. We're just loading in the CSV files. So this slide, what this slide is actually about is that at the end of the threshold scale, there's this thing called no limit. There's no limit in terms of how much an individual can donate to a candidate for the House. And so there was a question of, it's a great phrase from the CFI folks. Is it a difference in value or is it a difference in kind? And this has been a recurring theme. And so, like, the differences in value, and this is like a great insight, I think, from their side in terms of visualization. You want to show these things differently. If it's a difference in value, it makes sense to use different gradations. But if it's a difference in kind, if it's like a fundamentally different kind of thing, then maybe we should, try encoding it differently visually. So we tried with empty circles. And so this is like something that we sort of tried to bounce off them, and we ended up not using the empty circles, but the maximum value of the threshold scale is, in this case, a difference in kind, conceptually, at some level. Like, there's no limit. So we ended up using the gradations. But actually, we iterated a lot. We'll see later how it turned out. And then sorting makes a huge difference. If you sort by the value. So this one is sorted by the name of the state. And so it's great for looking up the state and reading, almost like a phone book, You can go to the state and look it up what the value is, which is actually the main use case. So we did sorting and we said, oh, it's so much more beautiful. And you can see trends, But ultimately, they wanted to be able to look up things like a phone book. So this is the default. They requested that this be the default, and then you have the option to sort it. But I like sorting has a huge impact. I think you could apply this in a lot of different visualization scenarios. We're sorting by the value in the current year, which in this case is 2014. It's bolded. Here the year goes from 1996 to 2014. By the way, that's like the range of years, and it's every other year that we're seeing. Yeah.
So the sort order there is, I thought perhaps the light yellow would be on the left, and then you would end up in the no limit on the right.
Right. This was that difference in kind thing.
Yeah.
We wanted to highlight. This was actually my doing. I'll take the blame for this one.
So yeah, I did this purposefully to put no limit all the way on the right because I wanted the one sort of exception, like the Sesame Street case, the one exception to always sit on the right, no matter how we sorted the other stuff. So the way that it worked was even if we sorted the rest of the cells the other way, the ones on the right always stayed on the right regardless. So that was kind of the thinking on that one. Again, it was just to point out that these are the corrupt states that, sorry, that's my soapbox. Mm-hmm.
So one thing we noticed with circles is that if you compare the colors of two circles that are next to each other, if it's not that big of a difference in color, it's not that easy to compare as compared to squares that are next to each other. Because if the squares are next to each other, you have that whole space on the edge of the square where your eye really pops, and your brain's edge detection kicks in, and you can see very clearly the differences in adjacent colors. And that's what CFI was most interested in, is changes over time. When do things change? Like in New Jersey, it changed in, between 2004 and 2006, and you can read it right off of here really easily. But with this this version, you see New Jersey, it's like, it doesn't pop as much. And so they had this issue with like, the changes over time don't pop out. Like that's a problem, So this is how we addressed it. And I know this slide is confounding the color change with the squares, but I think we made these changes at around the same time. Because one of the ideas was when we were showing them these, they were saying, well, it doesn't really look like CFI. Like we have this bluish kind of color scheme. Could you make it blue? So we made it blue. And so now it sort of fits in with the CFI theme, the website.
These are all, by the way, Cynthia Brewer's colors. You can just say that.
Oh yeah, these are all from Color Brewer, by the way. Cynthia Brewer, Color Brewer. It's a fantastic tool for picking colors. That's where these colors came from.
What did you say?
Color Brewer. Yeah, if you
Color
do.
Brewer 2.
And this one's a sequential.
Yeah, it's a sequential color scale. So Cynthia Brewer did a lot of research in color and color design, and she's made this tool called Color Brewer over the years, and it's like sort of well established as the reference for color palettes. And I want to also talk about a very subtle thing, which is I think originally we had the squares right next to each other, and then you couldn't really tell when one square ended and the other square began. And that was sort of problematic. So we ended up putting these very subtle lines, like if you see the blue grid, there's lines you can tell where the squares are, but you can also still compare the colors that are next to one another. Yeah.
Did you draw the squares apart or draw the grid on top?
Yeah, so the question is, do we draw a grid on top or do we draw individual squares? And I think the answer is we draw just individual squares. And I think that's how it panned out.
That's what I remember.
Yeah, I think it's the stroke.
Lines of the stroke.
Yeah.
It's the stroke configuration on the rects. It's just a bunch of rects. We're not drawing lines. Oh, you're inspecting the DOM? Nice. Yeah, there's your answer. So yeah, we fiddle around with the stroke settings. Makes a huge difference. This is another iteration of the colors. We iterated a lot on the colors because every time we show it to them, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, it's great, but like, we don't really like the colors. Can you change the colors?" So that was a big part of the process, and we want to get the colors right, and they're really important actually. So it's great that we spent a lot of time on the colors. This one is an evolution of the colors, such that the things at the ends of the color scale are difference in kind from the blue ones in the middle, but they're difference in value within the same kind in a way. So that's why we had like different shades of red for prohibited versus no limit, and then different shades of blue for all the values in between. So it's sort of getting into more subtle aspects of the color.
So can I just,
Yeah.
so do I read this correctly, that Alabama went from no limits to contributions prohibited altogether?
That's right. Yeah, you're reading it correctly. Alabama, between 2006 and 2008, transitioned from having no limit to being prohibited. Yeah, that's right.
Wait, so hang on. The veracity of the data itself is under, I don't know, we can't guarantee that. We can only tell you that we're showing what
We're showing the data that they gave us. But their process, like they had a lot of like little glitches. And actually, one interesting thing about this project is that by showing them the visualization, only then did they realize the problems that they had in their data. And so visualization, like usually the first pass, in my experience, of a visualization, it reveals flaws in the data that maybe you didn't know was there.
Hey, buddy.
Yeah.
Do you ever get curious and go and look at what else is happening and you see those really distinct changes? Like I think the York or CA makes it. Do you ever look at like what's going on or why they would make a really big change? And if there was like a political shift, maybe they went from Democrat to Republican in the House.
That's exactly the kind of question you should be asking.
Well, you didn't use
So you did a great job. I was wondering.
So the question is, did we look deeper into it and we saw things pop out? And no, we didn't. I didn't, at least. I can't speak.
I didn't look deeply into it.
But I think this is we're sort of looking at it at a meta level. Like, can we present it clearly enough that anybody who looks at it would immediately have those questions? And so that's sort of what we're after. So that when somebody sees this, they would have those questions like, oh, what happened in California? That's kind of weird. You know? Like, it went from prohibited to no limit for 6 years, and then there's a threshold. Like, how did that happen? We don't know. But actually, that's sort of the utility of building this, is to reveal these things and then provide this as a tool for people who are digging deeper. And I think the main constituent, like the main audience for this, are researchers who are really into campaign finance law, and they understand the forces at work and things like that, and different laws and different shifts in the political landscape. Researchers and also journalists who just want to sort of use it as a reference maybe, and the casual person who's getting into campaign finance as a topic. Yeah, great question. Oh, and then I made this one because I'm like, come on guys, size is really good at encoding values, numbers. So the blue ones are the differences in value, and then the red and the green. Well, I made it, and I'm like, hey, it kind of looks like a traffic light. Why don't we use those colors that people already know from traffic lights? You know, so stop, the red one means prohibited, and green means go, means unlimited. You're able to donate an unlimited amount. And so when I built this, I was like, oh yeah, this is like the greatest way of visualizing. So we showed it to them, and he said, you know, back in my day when we went to the movie theaters, we used to have these candies that we would get at the movie theater, and this looks too much like those candies that we would get. Those little, you know, papers, the strips of papers with the little green candies that were hard. And and he's like, whenever I look at this, I just can't help but think about those candies that I had when I went to the movies as a kid. So so they sort of rejected this one because of that. But it was, you know, we tried it out. Here's a variation where we use squares and circles. Didn't really pan out either. And then we put everything together into one page, and this is the unification of the grid and the map. So the map is showing one slice of the grid. In this case, 2014. You can see 2014 is bolded. It's in bold. That's the currently selected year. And then one of the interactions that we added was when you click on the year on the axis of the grid, it switches the data that's shown in the map to be from that year. And it was super effective. And we kept that till the end. And then, so this is one evolution of the layout, a big evolution where we put the two together. They're using the same color scale. And there's tooltips across both. Yeah?
Did you have an animated transition?
Yes. The question is, do you have an animated transition? I think at first we didn't, but then we did. We added it. Yes. Animated transition. So here's another evolution of the layout. The feedback that we got was, with this version, like, unless you're looking for it, the fact that 2014 is bold doesn't really pop out at all. And this is sort of due to the site issues that our client has, too. But I think it's a totally valid point. So we took that into account, and we said, okay, we're going to add it says 2014 now on the map. So when you look at the map, it's clear that just by looking at the map, okay, this is in 2014. And then at their request, we added this text at the bottom that says, please click on a year to change the data shown on the map. And resort the grid. Oh, that's another thing. We had the sorting tied to the clicking. So we conflated these two things unknowingly, which became a problem later. But that's a side topic. So yeah, when you clicked on the year, it would resort the grid and then use that data on the map. And then they said, oh, we don't like that color. It's too fleshy. And that didn't come to my mind at all. But I love the feedback cycle. You know, it's about getting feedback and being in a feedback loop with the client. I think we really hit a really nice cadence where each week we'd have a call and get feedback and then iterate based on the feedback. And so we try to make it less of a fleshy color. Oh, then eventually we made it this red, this like really eye-popping red, because I think that's what they wanted to sort of stand out, is when there's no limit. Or I forgot how we arrived.
That's less regulation, right?
Yeah, less regulation. So I think that they want that sort of to stand out more when there's no regulation at all. It's like red in your face. And a couple other things have changed here. We rearranged the layout of the menus. We adopted Bootstrap. So now it looks nicer, it looks bootstrappy. And it became clear that this donor-recipient branch thing is only a tiny fraction of the data set. It's only one topic covered by the data set.
Looking at this, I would say this was probably done by Democrats.
Looking at this, you'd say it's being done by Democrats. That's a great point.
It was done by
Yeah.
Democrats.
Right.
And I'm just, given the huge polarization of American politics these days,
Right.
was that an issue in your color choice?
That's a great question. I don't think that ever came up, actually. We were trying to use the CFI theme with the blue, and we just stumbled upon red as an eye-popping value. And yeah, the association with Republicans and Democrats, actually, we weren't thinking about it. But that's a great point, because probably our
I
audience.
do have an input on that.
Yeah.
Sorry. So Ken, as far as the choice of the blues and reds in the palette, that actually came from CFI's own style sheet. So at one point in the things, you had imported their style.
That's right.
Their style.
We just were using their
And
colors.
so they actually had colors. You can see the blue in the CFI logo up there at the top. And if you go to the cfinst.org website, you'll see at least the blues that are on this. The blues that are currently on the up online are not those blues anymore. But that when we were doing this set of palettes, we were basing it on those colors that they had already. So we weren't thinking in terms of politically overloading any of this stuff. And when we started this in the summer. So yeah, I mean, I guess election season had kicked off in some way, or nomination season, but we weren't really in tune to that at the time.
These colors only deal with the contribution limits part of the database, but there's other parts. And so we had this choice, like how do we expand this? And we came up with this idea of tabs at the top, and they liked it. And so here's what one of the other fields looks like that's not numbers. We just threw it into, I think, some color brewer colors just to see what would happen. And this is what turned out. So this is a first iteration, of the categorical colors. And here's another cool thing that popped out. One of these fields had values of no and yes, and then changed mid-cycle. And a cycle, I think, in this case is 2 years. But you can see that you can see the change over time very clearly, that it goes from no to yes, and maybe in between there's a changed mid-cycle. And this is one of those instances where when they saw the case of IA, I think that's Iowa, where it changed mid-cycle for 4 years in a row, they were like, oh, that can't be right. So it showed a glitch in their data. And then there's missing data, which we encoded as gray. And they don't want to see any missing data by the time this is released, but that's on their side. But this revealed to them that was missing. Maybe they didn't realize before. So this particular field is e-filing required. And by the way, initially we just had a drop-down for the question, which is how they collected the data. They asked people questions and they filled out a questionnaire. And so initially we just had this drop-down, but then they said, well, people looking at that won't really know what that means. And we have a detailed description of the question. So we added this description thing below the question. That's the full text, which is, are candidates required to report electronically? And here's what another part of the data set looks like, the public funding part. These are sort of random colors. And then we got more involved with the UX. So before it was corp and canned for corporation and candidate. And in terms of usability, it's like, well, okay, that's like a database admin sort of view, but we want to, target real normal people with real full words. So we mapped it out and had like another level of indirection or something with the menus where now we have the full words, candidate, and then there's some more details like select a branch, House or Assembly, the Senate, Governor. That was just H, S, and G, I think, originally. So now it's a lot more, usable. It's a UX improvement, I suppose you could say. And then the topic came up of, okay, how do you introduce people to this page? How do they know what it means, like what the topic is? And so they came up with some copy, some text to present to the users, and this is sort of a first pass at presenting that. We said, okay, we're going to put some text at the top and on the bottom, sort of sandwich the visualization in text that sort of orients you to what this is. We didn't end up going with this. I think we wanted to use all of the screen real estate for the visualization. I think that's the main thing. And we didn't want to force people to scroll around to like get the visualization into view. But this was one of the first passes at presenting copy to the users. And so when we were discussing how do you present copy to the users, they actually made this mock-up. It was so cool. They made a mock-up for us of this UI. And they said, okay, we kind of want to have like this overlay text box that has some text in it. And then the first thing came to mind was like, oh, we can make a modal dialogue for this with Bootstrap. So this is like the first thing we tried, and which is like an isolated prototype. And they said, yeah, basically that's what we want. And so then we added these buttons about this topic and using this page. And we made them this blue color so they sort of pop out when you come to the page. If you don't know what the page is, you can click on it and get that modal dialogue. And then we iterated on the design. We moved that text, click a year to resort the grid up a little bit. Then we added more tabs. It turns out like, oh, we're not covering the whole database. We need another section for these other fields. So we added this other restrictions field, this tab. And we just kept iterating. We made the description a bigger box, and there's actually a larger segment of text or a special note. I forgot what they called it.
Yeah, that's right.
This is Simon's work. So this description box here, some of the fields have special notes or additional notes like that you should consider when you start to think about this, but they're not like above the fold kind of material. And so Simon had this idea, I don't know if you want to talk about it,
No, go ahead.
but it's this idea that this description box should not change size all the time when you switch the fields around, because it'll cause the whole page to lay out differently every time you switch the fields. So that we wanted to avoid that. We wanted to have a consistent layout. So we had this description box be a fixed height and then display the text the first couple lines and then have a little star and add the ability to scroll this to see the content below the fold, the special note.
And it was high enough to kind of show hints that there is text.
Yeah, you could see that there's text below there, and that was intentional. Yeah. And we had some issues with like presenting a 0 value as 0 in the tooltips, which didn't match with the legend, so we had to like go through and make sure everything matched up. So when you hover over a value that's prohibited, it should show you prohibited in the tooltips. So that took some effort. This is a recurring theme, a threshold scale with custom stuff at the end. It proved to be a little tricky to get to work right. Then we experimented with more interactions because the grid squares actually correspond to the states for the selected year. And so we had this idea like, oh, what if you hover over a state and that would highlight the state and the corresponding square in the grid. And so if you're coming at it initially, it becomes super clear that like, okay, these are the same thing. They're representing the same thing. And then we went further, and the CFI folks were like, okay, you still have to really look closely to see which year is bold. could we do something more like eye-catching so that when you see it from a distance, you can tell what the selected year is? So in response to that, we added this rectangle around the selected year. And so now it's pretty clear, this white rectangle. This is the selected year. So all the cells in that row, that's what's shown on the map. And then we improved the user interface around the grid sorting and the selected year. One other piece of feedback was you don't want to have to tell people what to do. We sort of didn't like having this click on a year to resort the grid text be there. Like, it should be obvious. So we added a menu instead so you could select the year. And I think that was a big improvement. Now we have another menu. It tells you, okay, that's 2008. Then we could remove the year from the top of the map, too, because that was kind of an eyesore, really. Didn't really fit in with everything. And then this is what we ended up with, this grid sorting alphabetically or by value, and then selecting the year. Oh, and then you have to have a data download page, which was sort of an afterthought in a way, but it turned out to be super important because the whole point of this project is to present the data to the public, this database. And so originally we said, okay, let's just give them the CSV files. And then we renamed them a little bit to be more descriptive. And then we ended up categorizing them in terms of the tabs to make the download match up with the mental model from the visualization. And this is what we ended up with. And we also put a license file in there because they were like, well, when somebody downloads this, what are they going to be able to do? What are the restrictions? And we had some discussions about licensing, and we ended up using the Creative Commons license for the data. And then I think the GPL, GNU GPL for the code. So this is how the download panned out. And then we had this discussion well, shouldn't darker values correspond to higher numbers? Isn't that like a convention in data visualization? Because we had it the other way around. And then there was this discussion well, darker values, we want it to mean more regulation, which actually corresponds to a lower dollar value. And so we experimented with swapping the colors, and I don't think we landed on our final thing yet. We're waiting for their feedback still on this one. But these are the different views you get. Dark to light or light to dark.
But it seems like in the current version you've done away with the red.
Yes, we've done away with the red in the current version, actually. So that was the result of this color scale odyssey that we went on. It was crazy. I learned so much about color design that I never even thought about. So I ran this project by a professor friend of mine, Professor George Grinstein, who I worked with for years. And he said, when you use the same color to mean two different things in two different tabs, you lose cognitive stability. And that's something I never thought about. Whoa, cognitive stability? What's that? And it's if you use the same color to mean two different things, the viewer has to adjust their mental model every time. And it's a burden. It's burdensome. There's no cognitive stability. And so ideally, every color would match up with exactly one thing always. And so we went on this adventure okay, there's actually there are lower thresholds in one place and higher thresholds in another place, but we were using blue for both of those. And so one of the outcomes was, okay, we're using a different color now for the lower thresholds. And then this is so I think I don't remember which pass. We did many passes of this. This maybe was the first pass at having a cognitively stable color palette. We still reuse some certain things though, like the brown, the dark red. We overloaded that intentionally as things that are empty-ish or null-ish. Prohibited, 0, no, and none all got the same color. And we ended up using purples instead of the greens. This was just a proposal idea. We used purples for the lower thresholds. And then we used gray for like sketchy things, shades of gray for sketchy things, like missing data or NA. But turns out NA was a known value, so we guessed wrong there. But this is the idea. Cognitive stability. Think about that when you're making visualizations. You know, is it going to confuse people to use the same color for different things? So this is how the color palette turned out in our almost final version of the colors.
Looks nice like that.
And I think it just looks really nice. You know, it looks really nice to see it all side by side. It was fun. This part of the project was a lot of fun. And I learned a lot about color. Amongst other things. Yes. So this sort of gives you a sense of the whole data set. This is what the whole data set looks like. I mean, they're not the whole entire data set, but a broad range of it. Along the way, I thought, like, how do you know how colors compare? Like, I wanted to make a little tool. So one small thing that came out of this was this little tool that I made to, you know, select two colors and compare them. If the marks are separated, that's the top two squares, or if they're right up against each other. And the perceptual difference is huge, actually. It's a lot easier to tell small differences if the shapes are right next to each other. But it's not that easy if they're separated. And this little tool shows you sort of the threshold of the difference that you can use in these different scenarios. And then we iterated again on the colors. Oh, and then we added this new interaction where if you hover over something in the legend, it highlights all the values in the visualization that match with that and fades everything else out into the background. So this was one of the more fun things to implement. Like, I got a rush out of this one. Like, wow, it works. It's so cool. It's kind of tricky, though, from the coding perspective. So, yeah, it worked out. It worked out well. Oh, and then there was a weird case. You want to talk about this, Iman?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So one of the fields that they have in the database. So remember, like, the Kern talked about it a bit earlier, but the the drop downs that you're seeing, they're basically what we did was we parsed the actual strings in the database. So the string was state party to state party, whatever it was. So that kind of formed parsing that formed these drop downs. One of the things that comes out of dividing stuff into drop downs is suddenly when you have 3 drop downs, you can combine them however you want, whether or not those strings exist in the database, right? And so one of the corner cases where that happened was state party to state party. It doesn't exist in the database because it's not a thing, right? A state party isn't going to contribute money to itself, or a local party. However, it can actually transfer money. So initially, like, we went through about a month or 2 months of this.
Back and forth.
This was a lot of back and forth where the client wanted to kind of draw the attention away from state party to state party. So we spent a lot of cycles kind of, hey, if we select state party as a donor, yeah, then let's like fade it out from the recipients. If we set it from the recipients, let's fade it out from the donor. But if it's already selected, then what do we do, right? So we have these different scenarios, these different corner cases that we had to solve. And then suddenly I was like, you know what, Simon, you're not a complicated guy. This is too much for you. Like, it was too much for my brain. So I was like, we got to keep this simple. How about let's just expose it and educate people about why it's not a thing. So I proposed this idea. I made some text, and you can see that the last sentence says, and this sentence is a filler. This is how you know it's me. And so I kind of proposed this idea to them, and I was like, listen, why don't we just use this whole legend space as an educational opportunity? And they actually really like that idea, so they're making some copy to accommodate this stuff. So that's a nice way of like having data viz show you data that maybe you didn't really think about wanting to show, but you know, you can rethink the information you impart. So thanks.
So now that we had that case, we need to make sure that there's nothing else that used the same shade of gray. And we did that. Yeah.
You did that. Yeah.
I did that.
You did the grueling work.
A couple of the pull requests are like, you know, avoid collisions in the shades of gray. You know, but I think it's worth it for cognitive stability. So I just want to end by showing the actual live demo. So this is the current state of things. There's tooltips. They're interactive. I think we're going to reverse these colors again, but
That's what it's feeling.
I don't know. You can select a year, and there's animated transitions with everything, including that little rectangle. And I showed this to my wife, actually, and the first thing she did is click on one of these grid boxes, and it didn't do anything. And she's like, something should happen if you click on these grid boxes. So I'm like, yeah, you're totally right. We should select that year. So if you click on the grid, it selects that year. And then the rectangle moves, and the map colors change, and the menu changes too. So actually now there's 3 ways to select the year. You can click on a grid item, you can click on the axis tick, and you can select the menu. And then hovering on these, it really highlights these, and there's some animations going on too. And there's these drop-down menus. You can select, party to party, and you get this like empty space that educates you as to what this really means, like it's not valid. So yeah, then you can start to poke around in the data. Okay, I'm an individual. Let's say I want to give to a candidate for the House and Assembly. Okay, how does that change if I switch to the Senate? And the things are slightly different. And you can use the arrow keys. I like the arrow keys because you can switch back and forth and compare and see what changed with the animations. And I haven't drawn conclusions from it, but you can do that if you want to. Poke around. And then there's different tabs, and each one has their own color scheme. So yes and no are consistently colored, and they're just answers to different questions. And then different tabs. Here's thresholds. The lower thresholds are purples, not blues. And all the same interactions hold. And you can sort by value. And I showed it to a couple of people, and they just kept switching this back and forth. Like, whoa, that's so cool. It moves. Yeah, so this is it. And then there's a download page where you can download. Oh, now it links in.
Oh, wow, look at that.
Woo! Yeah! This is a new thing. It links into their CMS. They have a content management system that they use for their website. They wanted to use that and integrate between these two things. So that worked out. And all of this is in GitHub. And at a certain point in the project, we adopted Jekyll. Jekyll is this great Ruby thing that lets you have it's a static site generator that's built into GitHub Pages, which is what we're using to host this. And so this was spearheaded by Simont, and this is a great thing. We moved all the configuration into YAML files that are baked into the JavaScript at build time, which happens on the GitHub servers, not our servers. And so, for each section, there's some configurations, YAML files, controls. So these are crafted. Oh, here's the labels. Here we go. That's a great example. What used to be H, S, and G, now the CFI folks can go in and use the GitHub editor and edit this file to edit the labels if they wanted to. Or anything. All of these arbitrary strings, they live in these YAML files. So this is a huge win, and it makes us feel a lot more comfortable handing off the project, knowing that they can go in themselves and edit these things anytime if they don't like the wording or they find a spelling error.
Or colors.
Or colors. Yeah, I'll show the colors too. So for each section, there's a file called legends.yaml. We've iterated on this structure, this configuration structure quite a few times. Please don't use commas in the labels. So everything has a name, a type, threshold, or ordinal, I think.
Oh, that comment is old. You can use comments now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because now that we're JSONifying the Jekyll stuff, yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
So I'll just do it live. Yeah, I'll make a pull request. So this is the process that they could go through too. It's just use the GitHub editor, change the file, and if this gets merged, which I'll request a code review from Simon here. This is our process, by the way. I'm living in India, and he's living here in San Francisco. So we do this. We have this great like pedals of a bicycle, you know. And so we try to always review each other's pull requests before merging it, and then when it gets merged, it gets deployed to production automatically. It's fantastic.
So what did you have it in before you had it in Jekyll? You had it in.
Yeah, great question. What did we do before Jekyll? It was all in the JavaScript files, usually at the top of the file where all the variables are. So we did our best to split it out, but it was still in the JavaScript files. And so we moved it out of the JavaScript.
Did you use any plugins from Jekyll?
Did we use Jekyll plugins?
Nope.
No, we didn't. And by the way, I just want to show, like, in the JavaScript,
Just show them how it's done.
there are these curly braces.
There it is.
So the JavaScript files are Jekyll templates. My mind was blown when I saw this. I'm like, Simon, that's genius. And so we have Jekyll read in the files from the YAML files, and then we JSONify it, which spits out JSON. So this little blob here gets replaced with inline JSON in the JavaScript source code at build time. So that's how it works.
And that line of code you saw is what built the tabs.
Yeah.
The visualization. Like literally, that's all it takes.
Yep, that's the one that builds the tabs.
So if you were to host this separately from GitHub, would you need a Rails server then?
If you were to host it separately from GitHub, yes, you'd have to have Jekyll running.
Right.
And so when we do local development, we use Jekyll serve -- watch.
Right.
Yeah, so you'd have to have a server running Jekyll. Yeah, but luckily GitHub Pages is running Jekyll, so we have to do zero infrastructure. But yeah, if you migrated away from it, then you
But
would.
I mean, the customer, are they going to host the production version of this like GitHub?
Yes.
Yeah.
I see, okay.
Yeah, we're hosting it on GitHub, and they're fine to use that as the final production deployment with GitHub in the URL. They're just going to link to it from their site. They're fine with it, so we're fine with it. But yeah, if you wanted to be like super pro, like we could get your own domain name and.
No, and they still can do that.
Yes, actually, you could.
They can still do that. Because
GitHub-
Blindness Center did that for their.
Yeah, GitHub Pages has custom domain feature. So if you wanted to get rid of GitHub in the URL, you could. But I think that's about it. I'm at an hour, so I think I'd like to say the end. And thank you for listening.